My talk is about auxetic deployments in the periodic setting. And here's an overview of the presentation. I will discuss three specific frameworks in two dimension. Their shared features are that they present scenarios of deployment from a tiling configuration to the full extent of the deployment. And in the many ways possible for deployment in general, I will emphasize the notion of auxetic deformation, which is a notion emanating from materials science, but it has a purely mathematical formulation, and that's the one I will review briefly over here. Then I will go to explain some geometry underlying the setting we'll be in, and then focus on a very important function guiding the deformation of these structures, namely the unit cell area function. And we'll see then the deployment trajectories. So here are the three main players of my talk. Let's explore a little what we see here. So we see all three are planar. This is more populated, this fragment. So let's discuss on this framework with hexagons. We have what I will refer to for as a central hexagon. We may imagine, because frameworks are equivalent up to isometries of the plane, we can imagine this so-called central hexagon as fixed, because an isometry will allow us to position it in a prescribed place, and also have it oriented so we can label the vertices in counterclockwise way: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So fixing this will eliminate the equivalence under isometries, and we can now see the framework is constructing by putting a connecting arm between the color-coded hexagons around our center, and between them the two arrows indicate two generators of the periodicity lattice. So you see that in principle, the central hexagon and its 6 neighboring hexagons with the arms you see in the unit cell provide the information for replicating indefinitely the by periodicity, the fragment into an infinite array. Here, a framework with squares is constructed likewise, but based on a central square. Here I have eliminated distractions to concentrate more on the few essentials which are needed. And for the framework with equilateral triangles, we see even fewer, but fewer details in the picture, but they are the essential ones, allowing the spread of by periodicity of the shown fragment. All right, so these are the players. Why? Well, if we look in the materials literature, these framework structures have been considered for quite some time. But as usual, when you make things and want to test them, you have you see in the materials literature quite a bit of variation. So in this illustration from 1997, we see what was called a chiral honeycomb, because in this position you see clearly an orientation. So a handedness or chirality, but I avoid this terminology because when we are in the bar and joint framework setting, we will see that if we allow the full deformation space of the structure, it will pass into its mirror image, and so chirality may be a bit of a misnomer, and in our settings, so I'm avoiding that terminology, but nevertheless you will encounter it all over the place in the materials literature. And here's another illustration from a more recent paper. This is made of shape memory alloy. So you recognize here pretty much the central hexagon, its connections, arm connections between hexagons. And if you have this from a flexible material, which moreover has these physical properties of shape memory, if you fold it, and in this case you would wrap around those arms, if you fold it and then leave the structure to itself, it will gradually almost recover its diploid state. I bring this about because all the three structures considered here have been made and studied in alongside this pattern. So the pattern itself is not of recent date. If we look at this illustration from tiling produced in the 16th century, these are actually ethnic tiles, we recognize here the pattern of the framework with the squares, but also the resemblance with the previous slide with chiral models is obvious. We see from the central piece these arms, four arms going around. So the patterns themselves as periodic patterns can be found in a fair number of Islamic motifs. So the interesting thing is that for us is that they all offer scenarios of opening up, and to speak in the way most often encountered in the literature, we'll call such motions deployments. So let's see, in the simplest case, what will be our concerns. So we have here the framework with the hexagons in a tiling configuration. So there's what I called earlier the central hexagon, and we have aligned the arms with the edges, and you see at this point why all the arms are of length equal to the regular hexagon, because in this way we can really achieve the tiling. And now we can open up. So you see this arm initially was aligned there with the edge, so it's camouflaged by being aligned with the edge. But now we open up, and this is an intermediate position. And if we go to the full deployment, we reach this stage. You see now the reference arm number one is positioned along the diameter of the central hexagon. And we may continue this way, and then we will fold from the deployed position back to a more compact position and reach here another tiling crystallographically, it's equivalent to that one, but as a point in the deformation space of the initial framework is a different configuration. So it's time to explain more precisely what an auxetic deformation is. If we go to the description which still prevails in materials literature, auxetic behavior has been defined in terms of what are called Poisson's ratios. So if we have, say, this structure, and you pull the fragment, and now as in practice, you always have a finite fragment. So you pull like that, you see that the structure will, for a while, grow in size. And if you measure the lateral, so this is the stretching, which in this picture is horizontal, and then Poisson's ratio looks on the orthogonal direction, what happens. And what happens is that in the orthogonal direction, it also extends. So in an informal way, we may say auxetic behaviors means that when we stretch a material sidewise or laterally, it also stretches, which is rather counterintuitive, because most materials think of rubber segment. When we stretch laterally, it will shrink. So this has been theoretically seen as possible more than 100 years ago, but the actual modern interest in auxetic behavior go back 30 years plus, and I have here a reference to a survey where one may find such details. So Poisson's ratio is the ratio of these lateral behavior to stretching. Now we go to the mathematical definition, which was introduced in my work with Ilana, and here's the reference. So let's see how this can be formulated purely geometric, in a purely geometric way. Once we have, of course, geometric description of the framework, but I illustrated earlier our frameworks, so we know what periodicity means. It's a lattice. We choose generators for that lattice. And let's see, one definition is that the term auxetic applies not to the framework itself, but to a one parameter deformation. So when we deform with a parameter t, then at every moment we have a basis of the plane. I will discuss in 2 dimensions. It's obviously the same mutatis mutandis in arbitrary dimension. So when we deform with one parameter, at every moment we have this basis, which is provided by 2 chosen generators of the periodicity lattice, which deform along and so provide a sort of a fine moving frame for the deformation. So at every moment we have a basis. We may compare then 2 configurations in this deformation path by the linear map, which takes the periodicity a basis at moment t1 or t2 to t1, and this provides a linear operator. Yes, and now in operator theory we have the notion of norm, and we want this to be a contraction. So if we evolve in time from t1 to t2, then t2 would be the subsequent moment. So the structure has grown, and when we look back from t2 to t1, we should have a contraction. So this was the initial definition, but the most useful equivalent definition is the following. So we have our one parameter deformation, and at each moment we can follow the gram metrics of the periodicity generators. And this gives us a map, which is called the gram map, from the deformation curve to symmetric matrices. So imagine this curve, the image in the space of symmetric matrices, and in the dimension 2, we have 2 by 2 symmetric matrices. So that's a 3-dimensional space. So this is a fitting illustration. And we have, exactly as in special relativity in 3 dimensions, the requirement that the tangent to the trajectory remains in the positive semi-definite cone. So this is actually in dimension 2, this is special relativity notion. And this analogy is quite good. In dimension 2, it's literal. In higher dimensions, there's a difference that in relativity, we have the light cone, which is quadratic, but the positive semi-definite cone in dimensions higher than 2 is more complicated cone, but still a classical object of inquiry. So this will be the most useful equivalent definition, but it's derived from that original conception, because a contraction operator means that if you look at the unit ball by a contraction operator, it goes inside itself. So if it contracts in one direction, actually it contracts in all directions. So this is how the Poisson's ratio vision is implied by the geometric definition. So let's see now some key aspects of this geometric setup. So I'm going now into arbitrary dimension D. We have a periodic framework there. We choose a basis of generators of the periodicity lattice, and then we have this what we call a gram map from a configuration which we see as a point in the deformation space. We shoot to the gram matrix of the D vectors generating the lattice at that moment. So this gives us a symmetric positive definite point here. So this is the gram map. It's the controlling map for what is going on with our structure in the same sense in which for, say, for finite robotics, we look at the end effector map. So one point of our discussion is that from the point of view of this analogy, the gram map is in the periodic setting the analog of the end effector map in classical robotics. And now this is obviously differentiable. So we take the differential, which means that we will get the linear approximation, which takes now the tangent plane at the considered configuration to the tangent plane to symmetric matrices. But this is a vector space, so the tangent at every point is the same space. And now Now here we can look at the semi-definite, positive semi-definite cone. And if we end up there, the infinitesimal deformation is called auxetic. And this immediately gives us the chief structure of the auxetic infinitesimal deformations. They all belong to the linear pre-image of this cone, and in semi-definite programming, and this is called a spectrahedral cone. So a linear section of the positive semi-definite cone is called a spectrahedral cone. So when we want to discuss auxetic deformations directly in the tangent space of the deformation space, at that point we will be in the pre-image of this spectrahedral cone. So that's obviously quite useful for various algorithms for deformations. And now let's revisit this hexagonal case where, let me do a quick count of parameters to see that this is a very convenient example, because it has exactly 1 degree of freedom. So why is that so? If we look here at a unit cell, we see that we have 3 hexagons inside. Yes, because these pieces of the yellow one are reassembled together there. So the central one being fixed, we eliminate equivalence and isometries with that. So we have 2 plates, the yellow hexagon and its partner. So placing 2 plates in the plane, each has 3 degrees of freedom, translation, rotation. So we have 3 plus 3 degrees of freedom. Periodicity may vary, and so that's 2 parameters, so that's 4 parameters for the variation of periodicity. So 3 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. And if we count how many bars, constraints we put on the structure, we have 6 bars around the central hexagon, and then, avoiding repetitions, 3 other bars. So we have 9 orbits of links between the plates. So 10 parameters minus 9 constraints is 1. This is the quick count of degrees of freedom. Of course, assuming the conditions are independent, they are in this case. So the local deformation space is just a smooth, one-dimensional manifold that is a curve. And obviously, we can use as a parameter the angle here between the edge of the central hexagon and the link to, say, the number one link. And since this goes around into a circle, we see that if we don't mind, and this is mathematically advisable, possible degenerations when we have an S1, that's a circle parameterization of the structure. And I will try now to present the animation, but as I outline the count of degree of freedom, we will see that if we apply this count to the framework with squares, we find 3 degrees of freedom, and to the one with triangles, 4 degrees of freedom. So while here the deformation is unique, it's a unique path, in the sibling cases, we will have genuinely more challenges because we have to choose between threefold, respectively fourfold world of possibilities. So the idea of choosing, of designing an auxetic deployment is genuinely at work in that setting. And for economy of effort, I will subsequently concentrate on the example with triangular plates. One reason being that a very close study of the squares pattern has been recently published, and the reference is in my abstract. So let's go now watch an animation of this hexagonal framework deploying and refolding. So let's see where maybe I should do this. Just a moment. I'm not finding the one I want. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
So here we go. Let's fold it to tiling. Okay, so you have the tiling configuration. This will be the moving arm, and this one parameter a motion of going around the circle with this arm, because of the 1 degree of freedom, will dictate all the rest of the periodic motion. So here we are deploying, and you have at the center illustrated the relative position of the linked hexagon with respect to the fixed central hexagon. So you see these diameters replicate what we have in the linked hexagon over there. So a relative rotation occurs, and in this will be the position of maximal deployment. In other words, we will have now the maximum of the area of the unit cell. And let me point out that the square of this area is exactly the determinant of the associated gram matrix. So let's watch the full scenario. I can continue around the circle. You see now that from the full deployment, I'm folding back, and when I bring the moving arm to align with now this edge of the hexagon, I have retrieved a tiling. But remember, we started here, we went this much, and now we see that mathematically there's no obstruction to continuing. In fact, we will have overlap and a bit of a crowding over there of the vertices, but this is the good thing to have in mind, because mathematically it's better to have the full circle as deformation space, not only the region without overlap. So you see that we can play crazily like that, and why is this unique deformation path in fact auxetic when we unfold like that? Well, you see that our particular choice of lengths and the preservation of the symmetry that you see going on makes at all times this triangle spanned by the two generators makes it equilateral. Since the gram matrix is insensitive to isometries, although the periodicity varies, the triangle would remain equilateral, and therefore the gram map goes to scalar multiples of the fixed equilateral position of the periods we started with, and this is sometimes called a dilational behavior. But as we increase the length of we increase the scalar, the derivative will be in the positive definite cone, and so these dilational motions are always auxetic. So this is the a confirmation that as we go from here to full deployment, we go along an auxetic path. So this deployment is auxetic, and if I go back now to the slides, we have seen the simplest example at work. So now we focus on the framework with the triangles, and let's look at it more carefully with the geometer's eye. So before looking at the animation, I will mark what is interesting to notice. So let's see the 4 parameters. I can move around arm number 1 on the white circle. I can move around independently arm 2 on a circle, and likewise arm 3 on a circle. So these are 3 parameters, but the 4th parameter is the relative rotation of the blue triangle with respect to the central fixed red triangle. So these are the 4 parameters: the arm angles and the relative rotation angles. So the natural parameter space is a 4 torus. So the circle S1 Cartesian product power 4. And the parameterization being rather natural, as you may feel, we may expect a bundle of good and pleasant and geometric and pictorially satisfying illustrations. So let me go to the animation now. Oh, it's not this one. Here it is. Okay, so I can move one parameter, I can move the other parameter, the third parameter, and the fourth parameter. So you see, it's quite a wealth of possibilities, and we see that if we make full use of all four parameters, the deformation space is the 4 torus. Now, for more pleasant pictorials, we will restrict to 2-parameter torus, and we'll go with the criterion of having equal angles over here, so that this subfamily of deformations preserves the threefold symmetry. You see, if we rotate with 120 degrees around the center of the fixed triangle, the framework will reoccupy the same, the previous positions. So we have an order 3 rotation group, which typically in crystallography is called a threefold symmetry. So the family preserving the threefold symmetry will now have only 2 parameters, because one arm will dictate the positions of the other 2 and the relative rotation. And I wonder where my slides are now. Oh, there they are. Okay, so what are we going to look for? Well, when we have, say, a form of growth, we have these 3 types of growth. We may require expansion, which means that all
Share the screen.
Okay. Okay, here are the slides. And expansion requires all distances between vertices to increase. Auxetic has been presented, and auxetic implies area increase. So the hierarchy of growth types is that the most demanding is expansion, somewhat more relaxed, but still very conditional is auxetic, and the area increase is the most general. So now what is happening particularly nice on the two torus, preserving the threefold symmetry. So again, preserving that symmetry makes the periods equal in length and maintaining 60 degrees. So again, the gram map maps to scalar multiples of a fixed 2x2 symmetric matrix, and this shows that for our two family, area increase is automatically auxetic, which in general is not the case, that area increase may well not be auxetic. But this is the particularly pleasant feature now. So we can explore auxetic trajectories simply by observing increase in area. So that's where looking at the area function from the point of view of differential topology is useful, and it turns out that the area function is a Morse function. And these mandalas that you saw in a few of my slides are produced to illustrate the critical points. And there are 6 critical points. The absolute maximum of the area, which is the full deployment. There are 3 critical points of index 1. And there are, interestingly, 2 absolute minima where when the area vanishes, so these are in fact outside the proper deformation space, because vanishing area means the generators are not spanning periodicity lattice anymore. But you see the usefulness of nevertheless considering these degenerate positions from the a point of view of the mathematical analysis. And I will stop here. I'm reaching the limits of my time. We may revisit, if there is interest, the decorated animation, but I will stop here with a thank you to the audience. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Zeb.
Yes, so thank you for the talk. I was wondering, you talked about this a little, but perhaps you could say a little more. I have this notion in my mind that there's some results from people like Guest and Fowler that say something about how when a lattice is symmetric, mechanisms like the one you're showing should preserve the symmetry or can preserve the symmetry. And it seems like in your lattices, and I'm thinking specifically about the hexagons, some of the symmetries are preserved. There's a rotational symmetry about the center of the hexagons. It looks like it's preserved, but when it's fully compressed or fully dilated, it looks like it also has some mirror symmetries that don't appear in the generic state. And I was wondering if you think about the role that symmetry plays in that respect, what's preserved and what's lost.
Yes. So if we look, for instance, at the tiling position, then we see that in fact even the periodicity lattice can be enriched, and so from that observation we see that the structure is obtained from relaxing a structure with higher translational symmetry. So indeed, this is a leitmotif for periodic frameworks, and the maximal symmetry allowed by the abstract periodic graph can be realized. This is a beautiful theorem of Sunada, which we obtained via geometric argument in our mentioned paper, Geometric Auxetics. So yes, usually in a deformation, the full crystallographic symmetry of the framework may vary. So some symmetries may be lost or in reverse gained. And under conditions of preserving certain symmetries, one obtains a subfamily of deformations, as I actually exploited by picking up this two-parameter deformation within the four-parameter full realm of possibilities. And the two-parameter preserves the rotational threefold symmetries.